The general stood on the cliff edge, just as he had every year for the past 19, watching the wind stir the red dirt into spirals like ghosts rising from the ground. The sun hung low and angry in the morning sky, casting a gold blaze over the jagged trail below. The soldiers behind him whispered the name of the course, with the kind of reverence reserved for war heroes and tombstones. They called it the legendary distance, and no one said it without feeling something tighten in there chest. The ground below was not a track, it was punishment, the kind that tested more than muscle. It chewed through lungs, minds, willpower. It started with 2 miles of uphill gravel that shifted beneath every step as if trying to throw you off the trail. Then came the dead zone, a flat mile of white sand that reflected heat so intense men had passed out halfway across with blistered tongues and twitching legs. After that came a downhill sprint over loose rock, where knees shattered like glass. If the pace was wrong, if the body leaned too far forward, if the fear crept in, the final mile was the killer, a brutal incline. They called the cliff not because it was steep, though it was, but because, at its edge, your soul felt like it might fall off. Even if your body made it back. In the long history of this course, only a few dozen had ever completed it without injury, and only one had broken the record set by Commander Reeves. 15 years ago, the time etched in steel and shame, just under 43 minutes. The general remembered that day, remembered how Reeves collapsed at the finish, blood pouring from both shins, ribs cracked from a fall, teeth shattered, and yet a smile on his face that haunted the general to this day, because it was not joy, it was defiance, a final gesture from a man who had dared the impossible, and one the general had commanded many soldiers since then, but none had touched that time, not even close. They came, they trained, they ran, and they broke. Now he stood again, same boots, same silent eyes, scanning the fresh recruits, lining up like dominoes, waiting to fall their uniforms. Still stiff their bodies, unaware of the pain waiting for them, and among them stood a name the general did not recognize, a face that carried no history, no legacy, just youth and calm. That was almost eerie. His name was Ellis. No rank, just a rookie pulled from obscurity with a clean file and perfect scores on every preliminary test. But the general had seen perfect before. Perfect, cracked, perfect, begged for water, perfect, collapsed at mile 4 or mile 6 or mile 7, screaming about cramps or breathing or betrayal by their own muscles, so he paid. Ellis, no mind, no extra glance. The general had stopped searching for records to be broken because that record had already become something else. It was not a number anymore. It was a ghost, a barrier, a dare left hanging in the heat year after year, taunting anyone foolish enough to believe they could break it and survive. The morning air thickened the recruits. Stretched shoulders, popped boots, dug into sand. A whistle hung from the sergeant's neck, like a blade ready to drop, and still the general did not speak. He simply watched as the sun climbed higher, and the heat began to crawl across the trail like an invisible fire, because he knew what came next would not be about running or timing or muscle. It would be about something else, something deeper, something only the trail could see. Ellis stood at the start line with the sun behind him and the trail in front of him, and the others on both sides cracking their knuckles, rolling their necks, bouncing on their heels, trying to shake off the nerves that always came before the first whistle. One of them leaned over and said, "This your first run, rookie?" And Ellis nodded without looking, and the man chuckled and muttered, "You picked the wrong day to impress someone." But Ellis was not here to impress. He was not here to prove anything. He was not built like the others, no broad shoulders, no thick calves, no scars, no swagger. He looked like he belonged in a classroom, not a battlefield, like he had taken a wrong turn and wandered into the ranks by accident. But he had not wandered, and there was no accident. He had trained quietly while the others laughed and boasted about past races, about medals, won, about near victories on lesser tracks. They bragged about how they were ready for the legendary distance, and Ellis had listened and said nothing. He would rise early before the sun and run in the fog with only his breath and heartbeat. For company, he studied the layout of the course, memorized the rhythm of the terrain like a musician learning a song note by note, until the whole trail played in his mind without sound. No one noticed him then, just another face in the crowd, eating in silence, training in silence, reading old mission reports while the others played cards or watched vids. He was not shy, he was focused, and the general had seen that look before long ago, in the mirror before his own first run, but he pushed the thought away, because this was different. This was a rookie, and rookies broke. The man next to Ellis smirked and said, "I hope you like heat." And Ellis replied softly, "I don't mind," and the man blinked at the answer and turned away. Muttering something under his breath as the sergeant raised the whistle into the air, a hush fell over the group boots. Shifted into place, eyes narrowed, breaths deepened. Everyone leaned forward just a little, waiting for the blast that would signal the beginning of Pinellas. Did not lean. He stood still like a statue, like a tree rooted in earth, older than the course itself, and when the whistle finally came, he did not explode from the line. He moved with purpose, not power, not panic, just precision. As others sprinted ahead, arms pumping, faces tight with effort, Ellis fell into a rhythm early, his feet hitting the ground like they belonged there, like they were answering a call. Some shouted at him to pick up the pace, to move faster, to stop pacing himself like it was a game, but Ellis did not answer because he knew something they did not. He had walked this course every night in his mind, seen every turn, every rise, every deceptive flat that tricked runners into thinking they could rest, only to break them halfway through. And he was not here to chase them. He was here to chase the record behind them. The general said nothing. He watched the formation stretch out across the first incline, dust rising in soft clouds around the charging feet, and his eyes found Ellis, not because he stood out, but because he didn't. And the general frowned just slightly. Something about the boy, something unspoken. It was not in his build or speed, it was in his stillness. The kind of stillness that did not break under heat or pressure or noise. And for the first time in years, as the recruits disappeared into the trail, the general did not look at his watch. He looked at the trail and wondered. They called it unbreakable, not because no one tried, but because everyone who tried came back different, slower, weaker, quieter. The record set by Commander Reeves was more than just a number. It was a legend etched into the steel plate outside the barracks. 42 minutes and 59 seconds across 10 miles of punishment, and every year someone thought they were the one to beat it, and every year the trail reminded them that legend is not just earned. It is survived. Reeves had been more than a soldier. He was a storm in boots, fearless to the edge of recklessness. He ran like he fought with everything in him, nothing held back, nothing spared. His run was never meant to set a record. It was supposed to be a training exercise like every other, until he came sprinting out of the canyon, half his uniform shredded, one eye swollen shut, hands bleeding from a fall, and he collapsed at the finish with a grin and a whisper that no one forgot. A mate at the general had been younger than standing where he stood now, arms crossed, watching in disbelief as the medic checked Reeves' pulse and confirmed he was still breathing. No one had clocked the time right away, not until someone glanced at the digital timer and gasped loud enough to turn every head toward the screen. It was a number so low, it didn't make sense. So fast, it felt wrong, and yet it was real. From that day forward, the time became a wall. The recruits trained for it, feared it, cursed it. It was not a goal, it was a boundary, one that separated men from myths, and the general began calling it the legendary distance. Not for how far it was, but for what it demanded from anyone who tried to finish it, and more than that, what it took from anyone who tried to win the stories. Grew like roots twisting into the soil of the base, whispered around fire pits and weight benches. Recruits came and went, but the record stayed. Unmoved, untouched, like a dare written in fire, and every time someone came close, the trail pushed back harder. Some said the trail changed shape for those who ran too fast, that the desert itself fought to protect the record. Others believed Reeves' spirit still watched from the cliff, ready to curse anyone who tried to replace his name with theirs. But no one got close, not even the elites, not even the best runners, with perfect training and state-of-the-art gear, because speed alone was not enough, and strength was not enough, and heart was not enough. It took all of it, and more. It took something that could not be taught or measured. And now this rookie Ellis, no scars, no background, no battlefield story to carry him forward, was jogging up the second ridge like he was born on that trail, and the general could not look away. The others were burning themselves out, sprinting too early, drinking too late, failing to pace themselves as the heat pressed down like an invisible hand. And Ellis just kept moving, never rushing, never dragging. A sergeant nearby checked his scope and muttered, "Haze. Gaining ground, sir," and the general only nodded, eyes fixed on the dot that was Ellis, moving through the trail like he had done this before, like he had walked it in dreams. And the general felt something cold move through him, not fear, not hope, something older because it had been 15 years since he saw a runner move like that, and back then, it ended in a record that became a ghost stand. Now that ghost was being hunted again. The horn had long since faded into the wind, but the echoes of it still pulsed in the chest of every runner as they charged deeper into the trail. Their bodies coated in sweat, their lungs tight from dust and heat, and fear the first incline behind. Then the second stretch, opening up into the dead zone where the sun came down like a blade on bare necks and exposed. Dreams some had already slowed their strides, faltering under the early pace. Pushed too fast by adrenaline or ego, two were limping. One was vomiting into the sand, and behind them came Ellis, still silent, still steady, his steps placed like a carpenter, laying boards. His eyes forward, his breath controlled, his pulse unreadably. Was at this point that most broke, not from pain, but from doubt. The dead zone had a way of whispering lies into the ears of even the strongest, telling them they had nothing left. That the finish line was a myth, that the sun would never let them go, and that no one was watching but Ellis moved. Like he had heard it all before, and no longer believed in ghosts though. Man who had laughed at him earlier was now 10 paces ahead, his shoulders rising to high, his form, crumbling his pace, frantic, as if the trail might disappear if he did not conquer it fast enough. Ellis closed the distance slowly, without show, without effort, until the man glanced over and saw him there, and for a moment his face shifted from focus to fear. He tried to push faster, but his legs betrayed him. He stumbled slightly, cursed under his breath, and watched as Ellis passed, not with a burst of speed, but with a calm so unnatural it made him feel slower, heavier, weaker. Ellis did not look at him, did not gloat or smirk or offer a hand. He simply continued forward, as though the man had never been there at all. Further up the trail, the general stood atop a high ridge with binoculars pressed to his face, watching the rookie's movements as one of the aides called out times and split distances and updates from checkpoints to men down, 3 more, falling behind, no one on pace, not even close except. For him, the general whispered more to himself than anyone else, and the aide paused, confused, sir, and the general lowered the binoculars just slightly, his eyes still locked on Ellis, who now approached the hardest part of the trail. The downhill scrit was a treacherous slope where speed became the enemy, where footing turned to gamble and hesitation meant injury. It was the graveyard of records, and the graveyard of knees and ankles, and pride. Ellis did not hesitate. He did not slow his steps, adjusted only slightly, his arms extended for balance. His core tight, his gaze locked 3 steps ahead at all times. It was not reckless, it was controlled descent. Practiced, deliberate, something rare, even in trance. The aide kept reading times, and the general stopped listening because numbers could lie, but movement did not, and what he saw in that rookie's descent was not luck or chance, it was precision. The kind that came from obsession, from study, from the kind of training no manual could teach. Behind them a timer beeped, another checkpoint logged another runner falling out, and still Ellis moved like a ghost through the rocks, untouched, unshaken. And for the first time in years, the general felt the trail, watching not as a judge, but as a witness, because something was happening, something real, and it was no longer about beating the record, it was about what came after. By the time Ellis reached the bottom of the scree field, the sun had climbed high enough to make the rocks shimmer like glass, the air hung heavy and dry. Each breath harder than the last, each step more like lifting weights than running, but Ellis did not falter. He adjusted his pace, only slightly, let his arms drop for a moment, relaxed his shoulders, the way someone might between sets in a gym, not in the middle of a run that had already broken to more recruits behind him. Ahead of him, the trail dipped, then curved into the narrow pass, a brutal half-mile stretch, where wind-carved walls of red stone on both sides, where the heat built with nowhere to go, where sound itself seemed to vanish, leaving runners alone with the sound of their heartbeat and the weight of their choices. Ellis entered the pass with no change in expression, no sign of slowing his pace. He ran like he was following a map only he could see, like he knew exactly when to tighten his stride, when to shift his weight, when to breathe deeper, when to conserve one step at a time, deliberate and efficient, the same rhythm he had trained into his body when no one had been watching behind him. Voices thinned, gasps turned to silence, some stopped running completely, sitting with backs against the canyon walls. Others tried to press forward, but their strides had lost form, their minds cracked before their legs did. The dead zone had drained them. The scree slope had robbed them of stability, and now the pass was stealing whatever pride they had left. Ellis did not look back. He had never once looked back since the whistle blew, because for him, this was not a race against men. This was not a battle for recognition. He was chasing something else, something older, something that had called to him since the first time he read about the record and saw that number etched in steel up on the ridge. The general watched the monitors one by one. The signals from the trackers on the runners slowed, blinked, paused, turned red. But the signal for Ellis remained steady, moving, clean, and constant, cutting through each checkpoint without hesitation, and the aides started whispering behind him, not loud enough to break protocol, but enough for the general to notice. He silenced them with one glance, but even he could not deny what they saw. The pace, the timing, the position, all of it said the same thing. This was no coincidence. This was not a lucky run. This was a calculated campaign. Ellis came out of the pass like a shadow, rising from the earth, his uniform soaked, his face streaked with dust, his lips cracked, but his eyes were sharp, clearer than ever, and when he passed the 7th checkpoint, he was ahead of the ghost of Reeves. Hardin looked at the general, who said nothing at all, his face unreadable, but his fingers curled slowly into a fist by his side. Not in anger, not in excitement, something more complicated, something heavier, because the record was not just a number. To him, it was a memory. It was the last piece of Reeves that still existed, the final chapter of a man who had given everything, and now this rookie. This unknown quiet runner with no past, no reputation, no name carved into plaques, was on pace too. Erase Etan, the general could not decide if that made him feel proud or afraid. The trail did not care. The trail had no memory, only challenge, and now it offered the last stretch, the final incline. The mile they called the cliff end. Ellis never slowed. The final mile rose before him like a wall painted in heat and silence. It was not the steepest hill in the world. It was not the longest. It was not made of lava or guarded by fire, but it felt like it was built to end men, to pull them apart. A muscle at a time. It was called the cliff because no one made it to the top without feeling like they had been pushed over the edge, and Ellis was now alone at its base, with no sound but the wind and his breaths. The trail narrowed again, turned cruel. In design, like whoever carved it hated the idea of success, the incline was uneven, the terrain a patchwork of loose gravel and jagged roots. The sun sat directly above, now burning straight down into his back, and the air felt thinner, like it had given up on filling lungs properly. But Ellis never slowed. He leaned forward, adjusted his posture, shortened his stride, took in the pain, and folded it like a letter he had read 100 times. At the top of the cliff was the final marker, a small red flag fluttering weakly in the breeze. Next to it, a single medic waited, seated in the shade of a radio. Tent eyes on the clock, eyes on the path, waiting for the first silhouette to appear, and the others still scattered across the course, broken by the terrain and the weight of their own ambition, would not be that silhouette up on the ridge. The general gripped the edge of the console as the final split times lit up on the screen, green for on pace, blue for ahead of pace, and Ellis was glowing blue the whole way up. One of the aides asked quietly, "Sir, should we signal the checkpoint?" But the general did not answer. He only stared through the binoculars, tracking that lone figure. Now halfway up the cliff, his form still precise, his cadence slower but intact, every step calculated, every breath rationed, like fuel. It was not supposed to be possible. This part of the trail was where even the best fell apart. They arrived here with time to spare, and left with nothing, their legs giving out, their backs seizing their willpower, folding in on itself like paper in rain. But Ellis climbed like a man who had already accepted the pain long before it began, like he had studied the mountain and already given it somewhere halfway up his ankle. Twisted slightly, and he caught himself with a quick step. His balance wavered for less than a second, and his left hand touched the ground, not to rest, but to push, and he rose. Again, like nothing happened, the medic at the top stood up slowly, staring down the slope, watching the figure approach, eyes wide, lips parting in disbelief, as the form grew clearer and the dust around it settled enough to see the face, not wide-eyed with panic or clenched in agony, but calm, focused, alive, back on the ridge. The aide turned to the general. Again, "Sir Hayes going to make it?" And the general still did not speak, because part of him had started to believe it too, and that part of him did not know whether to hope or to run from the feeling. Because this was the mile that defined legends, and the kid was rewriting every rule written into the trail, every ghost buried in the dust, and when Ellis reached the final bend before the summit, his hand brushed a jagged rock, slicing the skin below his wrist. Blood bloomed red, but his grip did not shake. He did not stop to look at Eth, kept going, and the general whispered, so quietly no one Harden might actually do it. The wind hit harder near the top, sweeping across the ledge like a final test. Like the trail itself was waking up and realizing someone might actually finish. The flag at the summit snapped wildly, as if it too refused to be caught, and below the medic stepped out from the tent. Eyes locked on Ellis, whose shadow now stretched up the incline, growing longer with every step. His blood had dried in a thin red trail along his wrist. His boots were caked in dust, his shirt stained dark with sweat that clung to his back like a second skin, and still he moved, not faster, not slower, just steady. A human metronome beating in perfect time with something ancient, something quiet that lived in the soil of the trailback. At the command post, the general dropped the binoculars and stepped forward, ignoring the aide still, calling out times, ignoring the radio chatter that buzzed with disbelief from the checkpoints. Ellis was 20 seconds ahead of Reeves' ghost, now maybe more, and his pace had not broken once since the start. The rookie had not looked back, had not stumbled, had not cracked, not even in the dead zone, not even on the cliff. The general remembered Reeves' final sprint, the way he tore up the last 10 yards like the earth was chasing him, blood flying from both knees, his scream echoing like a battle cry as he collapsed at the finish line unconscious before the timer beeped. But Ellis was different. He was not running like a man escaping death. He was running like a man chasing something only he could see. Medic raised his hand to signal the end was near, and Ellis saw it from a distance. Eyes, narrowing slightly, jaw tightening, but not from exhaustion, from focus, from understanding that the final seconds mattered, that this was where legends were not just made but tested. He leaned forward into the last stretch, feet pounding into the dirt. Each stride shorter but sharper, like he had stored just enough in reserve to pour it all into the final 10 seconds, like he had mapped this very moment in his head 1,000 times. The last hill, the final surge, the breath held in the chest until the line was behind him, and then it happened. He crested the ridge. The flag snapped violently beside him. The timer flashed back on the ridge. The general blinked once and then looked at the number 40. 2 minutes and 56 seconds. 3 seconds faster. 3 seconds faster than Reeves. 3 seconds faster than a ghosty. Aide gasped softly and dropped the clipboard. The radio went silent for a moment before static filled the line, then voices shouting from every checkpoint trying to confirm what they had just seen. The general said nothing. He stepped away from the console, walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at the trail, now littered with runners who had fallen behind, who had stopped, who had failed, and he saw only one man standing at the summit, not raising his fists, not falling to his knees, not crying or cheering, just standing. Their breathing, chest heaving, slightly blood on his arm, sweat on his brow, eyes calm as if waiting for someone to say something. The general stared at him for a long moment and whispered a word he had not spoken since Reeves fell across the finish line 15 years. Aga legend. Ellis stood at the summit, with his chest still rising and falling, his breath steady but heavy, his hands resting lightly on his hips, and his eyes scanning the horizon, as if the trail had not just taken everything from him, but given something back. In return, the medic approached slowly, almost unsure of what to say or do, like he was witnessing something sacred and not meant to be interrupted. "You good soldier?" the medic asked, but Ellis only nodded once and looked back down the trail, watching. The wind erased the prints he had left behind, watching the rocks and dust settle as if nothing had happened, as if the trail had already moved on, but the timer had not moved. The number still glowed bright on the screen, and the base had already erupted into whispers and radio calls and stunned silence back at the command ridge. The general still had not spoken. He stood with both hands, gripping the rail, his knuckles pale, his eyes locked on the figure that had broken the impossible, and for a long moment he said nothing, while aides and officers waited, afraid to speak, afraid to break whatever this moment was turning into. Finally, he stepped back from the rail and turned to the aide nearest him. "Send the transport. Tell them to bring him down now and get the press cleared from the yard." He said it with a voice that was even but tight, like something had cracked inside, and he was not yet sure what it meant. When the transport arrived, Ellis climbed aboard without a word. He sat near the back window, staring out as the vehicle rumbled down toward the base past the others, still climbing, still crawling, still searching for strength in the broken parts of themselves, and not one of them looked at him, not out of spite, but out of something else, something heavier than envy. When they arrived, Ellis stepped down, and the crowd around the yard parted in silence. Not because they were told to, not because of rank or order, but because of the way he walked, still quiet, still steady. No swagger, no celebration, and when he approached the general there was no salute, just a single nod and a long moment where neither of them moved. The general looked him over. Him but at the eyes that did not shake, and the posture that did not bend. And finally he said, "You know what you did today?" Ellis said, "Yes, you know what that record meant, yes. Sir, and what it will mean. Now I do, Sirtha." General studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside and gestured toward the plaque on the wall, the one where Reeves' name had lived alone for 15 years tomorrow. "We put your name up there," he said. Lees looked at the plaque and then back at the trail barely visible in the distance. Through heat and haze and wind, and he nodded once, then said, quietly, "Make sure you leave Reeves' name there, Tootha." General raised an eyebrow. "He earned it," Ella said, "and I just followed where he led." The general let out a breath and nodded slowly. "Didn't just break the record, son, you did something else." "What's that, sir? You made the trail believe." Again, and with that he turned and walked away, leaving Ellis standing alone under the sun, under the weight of legend, not cheering, not raising his arms, not shouting into cameras, but quiet and still, the same way. He had arrived, only now the dust itself seemed to pause, as if honoring him manned the trail, waited for whoever came next.